Today, I'm chatting with Micah Baldwin. He is an executive coach and the global head of founder experience at Microsoft. He has 20 plus years of experience in the tech community and has been an early employee at several startups as well as an entrepreneur. Altogether, he's been a trusted advisor to hundreds of companies and entrepreneurs, including with the work he does now as a coach. He's also spoken publicly, which is how we connected, about his own challenges with bipolar disorder, addiction, and mental illness, sort of wrapped up within the context of being a high-performing entrepreneur and early tech employee. With his experience coaching a lot of entrepreneurs and that lived personal experience, Micah just has an incredible combination of the art and science and the lived knowledge that you only get by virtue of experiencing this stuff day to day. And so that's why I really wanted to chat with you today and dig into your experiences as part of this overall course I'm putting together for entrepreneurship and mental health. So thank you for carving out the time and thanks for sitting down with me.
Of course, super excited to have the conversation.
And to kick it off for the folks that are listening, run me through how you got into the world of startups and then the time in which there was a moment where you realized that you had either addiction or mental illness while you're running companies, while you're helping entrepreneurs, and how that unfolded.
Sure. So I started my first business when I was 9 years old. Parents didn't have a lot of money. So if I wanted to go see a movie or go out to dinner, I had to pay for it myself. And I realized really early on that if I was walking around mowing lawns, I could only make so much. But if I convince all the kids in the neighborhood to mow lawns for me, I could make quite a bit more. And so did that and started that first business and sort of was hooked. I always say that I became a farmer because I grew up on the farm. My dad was at Stanford for 25 years. My mom worked in startups and she'd get laid off from a startup and join another startup. So grew up in the Bay Area and was very born into the startup land. I don't know if I could do anything else. I don't know what else I would do. I continued to start small businesses through high school and into college and really launched my first company back in around 2000. Where I built an actual company and hired actual people and made actual money and became something real. And then from there, just kept going. The business that I started in 2000 was a marketing automation company and agency. And one of the things that was really interesting about the ad world then was that it was very, very party centric. So in order to do a deal, you basically went out with somebody and, you did stuff every night. Well, what I realized over time was that my Tuesday night was somebody's year, right? Like it was their best time ever. And I was doing this every single night. And I got to a point where I realized that I had started to take addiction seriously and as seriously as a business and became an expert at it. The final breakdown for me was I was in California with a friend. Who owed me a lot of money. He had stolen probably about $50,000 from me and had indicated that he was going to pay some of it back if I went out to California with him. And so did. And while we were out there, obviously drugs and alcohol became clear that the money wasn't going to show up. And so finally decided to go back to Colorado, went to find my credit card to buy plane tickets and it was missing. And so I assumed I had just lost it at a bar, right? Because that's a pretty common thing. And went back to all the bars, couldn't find it. Finally came back to the apartment. My friend said, "Don't worry about it. I'll buy you a plane ticket to get home. You can figure it out when you get home." And I said, "That's great." Got to the airport, went into the bank to shut off the credit card and realized that there was 2 plane tickets bought on it. One for me, one for my other friend who was there, and realized that credit card had been stolen from me.
Wow.
I got home and went on a 7-day bender. It was pretty bad. And realizing all of this was my own fault, right? Like the whole concept of the amount of drugs I was doing, the amount of drinking I was doing was really driven by my own choices. And I got to the point where I realized that what I was choosing was death over life, right? Like I was choosing to kill myself, but I was doing it in the slowest way possible. And finally on April 1st, 2006, I sat down and decided that I was either going to go to sleep and that when I woke up, I was either going to continue to do drugs or I was not going to do drugs or I was going to kill myself, one of the two. So went to sleep, woke up, looked at the drugs, decided I wanted to live. And then from that point forward, worked on my sobriety. About a year later, sold that company, right? Because I realized that I couldn't be part of it any longer. and then went off to go work for other startups and continue down the way. But that was sort of the addiction story. The interesting thing was 2 years after I got sober the first time, I was talking to my therapist, and my therapist is like, dude, I think you have bipolar. And I'm like, I don't know what that is, right? Like, what do you mean? He's like, I think you got bipolar. Like, you need to go to a psychiatrist and get it checked out. And so I went to a psychiatrist and sat down, and he started asking me questions, just weird questions like, do you ever smell like something's burning and there's nothing burning? Or like you hear somebody call your name in a crowded room, but nobody's there to call your name? Do you sometimes think you see ghosts? Just all these crazy questions. And literally the answer to every single one was yes. That totally happens to me. Like sometimes my cat will sit on my lap and leave, and I think it's still sitting there, right? I can feel it in my lap. And at the end of it, he goes, yeah, bipolar too. And I went out to the car, called my mom, cried, told her that for the first time in my life, I felt somebody had figured out what was wrong with me, and immediately started to work on what it meant to be bipolar and an entrepreneur. And that's sort of the story.
It's a hell of a story. I appreciate you sharing all that. And
Thanks.
I got a lot of questions that come up from it. One of them is, so you're still busy running this company, and in the midst of it is when this awareness around the nature of addiction and bipolar disorder is sort of coming into view for you. And when you look back at that now, and when you think about the work you do today with entrepreneurs, like, how do you think about what an entrepreneur should do if they're in the midst of building something and running something, and then they become aware of their own addictions or aware of their own mental illness in whatever form it may take? How should they navigate having to focus on their own health while at the same time they're running a company and may be responsible for the payroll of many other people?
And not surprisingly, I've worked with a fair number of people that have had that question. You got to get healthy. Straight up, you got to get healthy. If you're not healthy, you're not helping anybody. And the further you dive into your addiction, whether it's drugs or alcohol, eating, sex, porn, whatever it is, the more you're taking energy away from the thing that you're trying to build, the more you're reducing the ability for it to be successful. Even if you're doing really well, it could do so much more, right? If it had 100% of your brain. And right now with addiction has 100% of your brain. And so the fact that as an entrepreneur, you can be successful while being in the midst of an addiction is really a testament to like how good an entrepreneur you are. It's not really a testament to the fact of that you're able to handle your addiction. So you have to be able to hold off. You have to be able to handle it. And sometimes that means going to rehab, inpatient rehab, right? And taking 30, 40, 90 days off to do it. I think that the biggest fear that most entrepreneurs have is, how do I tell my board? How do I tell my employees? What do I say? And it's such a hard question. It's such a personal question. I've been very open about it because I honestly don't believe that my success is held by anybody else but me. I'll be able to get to where I got to go because I'll be able to get there. But I also know that there are probably people in this world that will never invest in me or work with me because I have addiction and mental health issues. So I'm willing to do that because I also know that I'm probably being helpful to other people by being open about it. And I think for every entrepreneur, you got to kind of figure out what works for you. I think legally, you should check what your charter says, because often there are clauses that are around incapacitation and other things. But here's the reality of it. If you are truly addicted, if you are what they say in a real alcoholic, everybody knows.
Yeah.
Like everybody knows. I remember I went in to my employees to kind of apologize to them after I got sober. And I sat down and I was like, hey, I just want to apologize. I was heavy into drugs and now I'm no longer into drugs. I'm going to be here 100%. And they're like, oh, we know. And I'm like, how'd you know? I thought I was so good at hiding it. They're like, you smelled like a homeless person. Like you never took a shower, right? And I was like, oh, well, that's a good indication. So the truth is that you cannot hide addiction.
Yeah.
No matter how much you think you cannot hide addiction. And therefore, the only option you have is to take care of it.
Yeah. And at a minimum, they'll probably just be wondering, like, why does so-and-so just look like shit? Right.
Yeah.
Why are they so irritable, or why are they so tired? Like, they're going to detect that at a minimum, you're just not doing well. And they may just make the basic assumption that you're burned out and tired. It's not too far of a leap if they find out, oh, it's, you've been doing drugs or drinking, they're like, okay, that connects the dots. And I want to reinforce the point you made previously about, like, you got to get healthy first. And because the way I describe addiction to folks, I went and spent 45 days in an inpatient center a couple of years ago. This is right at the time where I decided, like, I'm done as an executive, as a venture capitalist. I'm not doing this anymore. Being in active addiction is the narrowing of the aperture of things that bring you joy in life. And whatever the addiction is, it's like sucking all of the dopamine towards that thing. And then everything else, all the day-to-day stuff where you might normally feel a sense of joy or wonder, it just disappears because it gets taken away by that thing that is a black hole of feel good. And so if you're in that state, like, even if the company's doing well, or you really enjoy the team that you've built around you, you're still not even going to be able to properly enjoy it, let alone perform extremely well or demonstrate the creative capacities that are necessary sometimes to be an effective leader. So I think that's a really important point, a hard one to do, because I got to imagine, in the mind of a lot of entrepreneurs and executives and CEOs are thinking, to use poker terminology, it's like, I'm pot committed. I've put so much into this. How can I step away? But I think building on that is, I'm curious for the folks that you've worked with, it sounds like you've encountered this situation quite a bit. I think the tendency for the entrepreneur is to think, well, if I step away from my company, then nothing positive will come from this. Sure, maybe I'll get sober, but my career is over. From what I've experienced, that's not necessarily true, but I'd love to just get your sense of, and if you want to anonymize it or in through whatever format you want to, like, when people make that choice to step away to focus on their health, like, there's all sorts of different ways it can unfold, but what have you seen are the ways in which it does unfold?
I think the most important thing is that life is spent putting your oxygen mask on first, right? Like, you cannot live life unless you put your oxygen mask on first. And the most interesting thing, so I'm coming up now on about 5 years sober. So did my initial sobriety, had some bounciness in the middle, and then committed to joining AA and doing the whole thing. And so come September, if everything works out properly, that'll hit 5 years. The most interesting thing to me, sitting inside of an AA meeting and now having been to hundreds of them, is that people early in sobriety believe that the world's coming to an end and that the life sucks and, like, there's just nothing for you, and that the only thing you can do is try to get sober because there's this glimmer, this tiny glimmer of hope that your life will be better. And then come 6 months, a year later, and people are talking about all these amazing things that are happening in their lives, right? Like new relationships, new jobs, bunch of money, things paid off, right? You're not a different person. You've just stopped doing drugs and alcohol. You're still who you are. And so you still are that person that built the company. You still are the person that was able to get to where you needed to go. You're just removing a barrier to your own success. And so if you step away and come back, the likelihood is most people are going to be happy that you're back because you were good enough to build that company in the first place. The other thing that I also find really interesting about AA is that there's a step 9 is about making amends, right? And amends really isn't about saying, I'm sorry. It's about taking responsibility for your part in destroying a relationship. Everybody freaks out about amends, right? Like, oh my gosh, I got to go make these amends. I got to say sorry. I got told an ex-girlfriend, an ex-wife, my mom, right? Like whatever. And I always tell people to do the hardest one first, because 9 times out of 10, that person loves you the most and is just happy that you're healthy. 9 times out of 10, when you come back to your company, they're just happy that you're healthy. Your investors are just happy that you're healthy. The hard part is that every entrepreneur fights with imposter syndrome. And the biggest thing that you can say is, well, I guess I'm actually am an imposter because look, I'm doing drugs and alcohol. I'm not the person I thought I was. And so battling through that and realizing that the drugs and alcohol is the disease, is an illness, is an allergy, however you want to look at it, that's causing you to act in certain ways. And that if you take care of that disease, that allergy, that illness, and you can be 100% who you're going to be, those people that were there for you, that loved you, that wanted you to be successful are going to double down on that. And you have to have that opportunity, right? You have to give yourself the opportunity to see that happen.
Yeah. And that's been my experience too, is like, if you had a network of folks and there came a time to make amends, to have these disclosures, to share the full truth and nothing but the truth, that sure, there's going to be some people that kind of shrivel off into the background and you lose that connection with them. But then there's going to be others that just like clutch onto you with even more love and respect and support. And you get so much closer with those. And so it just sort of like cuts through the bullshit. And you find out like, okay, these are the people that care about me. And in addition to these skills and abilities I have as an entrepreneur. And then these are the folks that don't. And actually, I'm very cool with that. Now that I can tell the difference between them, I know who I actually want to work with moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And who wants to work with me, right? Who's willing to step up and really make a difference in my life, right? And the relationships that I have now sober are 10 times better than any relationship I had when I was doing drugs and alcohol. And that's because they aren't about drugs and alcohol. When I got sober, I remember my therapist telling me, and I said to him, I'm like, all my friends disappeared. Everybody disappeared. And he's like, because you all had a shared secret. Right. So they're off. You're not part of the crew any longer because you don't share that secret. So they're off doing their partying ways and you're off doing something different. But the people that stuck around, like my family, like my real friends, the people that had material effect in the positivity of my life, those people are still around and have been around ever since.
And you just bond with them so much more closely. I want to spend a little more time too talking about, like, let's imagine the scenario that an entrepreneur is listening to this and there's a part of them that's like, I am drinking too much, or I'm out hiring prostitutes a couple nights a week, or whatever the scenario is. They're confronting or prepared to confront like, hey, I'm numbing out, I'm coping in some way that's not healthy for me, and I'm having a hard time stopping. For that entrepreneur that's listening, and if they want to start moving in the directions of sobriety, what are the first pointers that you give them? What are the suggestions that you make?
I sound very much like I'm a promoter of AA, mostly because AA, I think, has done really well for me. I do think that it creates an interesting framework to live under and what they call a design for life, right? And a way of living. It does have a spiritual component to it that can bleed very much into God and feel very religious. And so there's a lot about it that I don't like. I believe in spirituality. I'm not a huge religious person. But the thing about AA that I think is interesting is that the only requirement for membership in AA is a desire to stop drinking. So if you want to stop, if you just want to stop, but don't know if you can or can't, you've taken the first step, right? Like you've taken the first movement. Since we're talking about steps, I probably should just keep to the steps, to the actual steps. But you've made that movement towards life, right? Of living a different life. And then once you realize that your life is unmanageable, right? Like you're at a point where you cannot manage your life 100% because of the drugs and alcohol, you're starting the 12 steps. Like that's literally all there is to it. So normally I ask them to go to AA with me. And I'm like, just go sit in a meeting. Don't say anything. There's no requirement to stay. You can leave if you want to leave, right? Find one on Zoom, turn off your camera, turn off the microphone, go about your day and just listen, but just listen. And what you'll hear is you'll hear people telling your story. You will hear people that have the same problems that you do. They're not specific, right? Your problems are specific to you, but they're the same shit, right? Like they're the same stuff. And for me, I was blown away when I walked into a room full of people that I would not normally hang out with, right? They weren't techies. They weren't startup people. They weren't entrepreneurs. They were just good, honest, normal people. And they would start sharing and they would tell these stories where I was like, whoa, dude, like, that's me. Like, that's me. Like, that's me. And I left and I went, well, maybe I should come back and keep listening. And that's all I did for a year was I basically went to meetings and listened. I didn't really share, didn't really do any of the things. I just listened. And there's something about knowing that you're a part of something larger right? That these people have gone through things similar to you, but now have been able to achieve much beyond whatever they believe. That is really life affirming, is absolutely a way to change mentality, right? Like it gives you the strength to know that you can get it done when you're in a room full of people that are getting it done every week.
Yeah. And you see that they're from all walks of life, and you realize that, suffering is something that is universal. Everyone has challenges in their own ways, but there's still something very fundamentally consistent across it that binds us all together. And then, at least in my experience, I remember finally, the first time when I did share, I just cried. I couldn't get the words out, right? But then just being able to say those first few words and just to get them off my chest, and then to be embraced by people that don't judge you, that accept you. It's this really magical moment. And it's this cathartic experience that is so hard to get to because of fear and wanting to avoid showing our vulnerabilities and what have you. But as soon as you can, you'll be a changed person, and you'll start taking that weight of the world off of you, or whatever weight you've been carrying, and then start moving in a direction where you realize, like, no, I actually want to be truthful all the time. This feels so much better. Instead, let me just take this mask off, and I'm going to go about life like this.
Yeah. And I think the other part that's really interesting about meetings is that, and again, not to bang the AA drum, but they're full of laughter. I didn't understand that when I started. Like, why are all these people laughing about literally the most horrible shit ever, right? It's the laughter of understanding. It's the laughter of knowing that they have been in the same place you have and been able to get out of it and get to where they want to go. And so I laugh constantly in meetings. Like, I think people say and I would imagine that anyone that was listening in, they'd be like, why are you laughing about that person getting a divorce or like ending up in jail? And you're like, because it's kind of funny. There's humor in it. So I think that's the other piece that people don't realize, is that getting sober isn't a thankless, joyless path. It's quite the opposite, right? Like, it's full of joy, it's full of thankfulness, and it's an amazing journey to go on if you can.
Yeah, it's a return to experiencing those little moments of joy of just the day-to-day mundane aspects of life. And I'm glad you bring up that point of the laughter. Yeah, it's almost like, this is why I love comedy, and it's to be cherished, is because comedy is built off of the back of suffering. And being able to laugh is one of the quickest and most universally effective ways of cutting through the ego and being able to take the heaviness out of the moment. Yeah, I like going into the meetings where it's almost this like George Carlin type energy, and it's helping. And if you're an entrepreneur, like, how many opportunities do you get to laugh when you're struggling day to day with your company, or when you've got to have this serious face on in the boardroom? This may be more cathartic and more of a release than any coaching or any therapy you receive. So
for sure.
Yeah. Well, I love that, man. Okay. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing your guidance on that. I also want to spend a little more time on this question of disclosure around, let's say we're in the scenario, again, entrepreneur realizes that they have mental health differences that they need to focus on. They're suffering in some way, or they have the addiction, and they make the choice to go and get this work done on themselves, to put on the oxygen mask first. I love that framing. There's the legal aspects, as you mentioned, and that is sort of step one. Look into what your fiduciary responsibilities are. But there's really this conflict or this challenge where, like, I know a lot of entrepreneurs that say, like, I don't tell shit to my investors because I can't trust them. Do not trust them. Or there's one investor on my board where I'll tell them what's going on because I trust that person, but no way in hell am I telling anyone else. Like, this is a common problem of, should an entrepreneur disclose to their investors? And if so, how do you do it? And to what extent do you disclose? I don't know the answer. It's nuanced for sure, but I'd love to get your take on that.
So hard. It's so hard. And I mean, some people don't even like to disclose that they're having a bad day, right? Like, some people want to think that everything is shits and giggles and having a good time. Like, it's really hard sometimes for people just to say, you know what, today I need a mental health day. Like, I'm going to go home and I'm going to play video games and this entire company can kiss my ass, right? Like, I just need a day. And I think people are afraid to do that, right? Let alone say, I've got an issue with my mental health or I've got an issue with drugs and alcohol. On the other hand, I think that not disclosing it is a bigger disservice to the company that you're running, right? Like, they need to understand that you have limitations and there's things that you need and that you need to work differently, right? You cannot work the normal 12, 14-hour days because they affect you differently. I also think that, so at Microsoft, they have this idea around leadership, around being a manager called coach, model, and care. And I really love it, right? So the idea is that you coach, right? Straightforward, help people understand where they need to go, help them grow in their careers. You model the behavior that you want your team to undertake, and then you care. You actually do care about the people that you're working with, right? And that caring can come in many ways, right? Like, you got personal stuff happening, great, take some time off, handle it, right? Do what you need to do. But if you're constantly holding everything in and you're fighting about telling anyone about your own mental health, then what's going to happen with the third of your company that's dealing with it as well? People don't get into entrepreneurship because they're right-minded, right? They get into entrepreneurship because we all got something wrong with us. So there are people on your team right now that are suffering and they don't have the ability to speak up because you aren't showing them that you need to speak up. That really fundamentally is where I come out on this, is that if you don't speak with honesty and live your honest truth, then the people underneath you will not either. And if you do it right, meaning that you do it with honesty and forthrightness, most of your investors will be fine with it. Yeah. Right. And the truth is none of them are going to ask for their money back. Like, it just doesn't work in a venture firm, right? Like, your IRR gets screwed up if you start asking for money back. So you usually don't ask for money back. So you're not going to worry about the money leaving. You may not get more. There's a high likelihood that they don't want to continue to invest in you. And that's okay, because it means that they weren't going to be there when you were at your bottom, right? And we want investors that help us at all phases of our journey, not just at the good phases.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I suggest to entrepreneurs is that when they choose to have that disclosure and they talk with the investors, it's also accompanied with what their request is. Meaning, an entrepreneur can say, okay, here's what's going on. I'm in a bad place. I've been drinking, so on and so forth. And I have to step away to focus on my health. And I'm sharing this with you because I want to do what's right by everyone involved. And that's why I'm having this open disclosure with you. But here's also what I need. It's like, it could be like, look, I need to be able to pay for my rent for the next 6 months, or whatever that request is. Be willing to make that request, especially as it aligns to what you need to get healthy again. Yeah, my experience has been that in the vast majority of the cases, the investors, especially when you handle it with that transparency and professionalism, they'll get together and they'll think like, okay, what can we do for this person who's been carrying the weight of this company for years? Let's stand up. I've seen some investors do some really amazing things.
Agreed. I think sometimes we forget investors are humans. Like, investors are checkbooks, but they are humans, and some of them aren't the best humans in the world. Like, for no doubt, there are some awful people that are in venture, but the truth of the matter is that the vast majority of them mean extremely well and want to do well by their. Here's the other side of it too that people don't realize. Most investors are not investing in your company. Most of the investors are investing in you, and they're expecting you to do multiple companies over time, right? And hit one. And that first one is like, it's like the first pancake. Like, it's probably not going to go well, but the second one is going to go pretty well, right? And so if they step up for you at the time when you need it, and you're able to bounce back from it, which most people can, then the likelihood is that you'll get that pancake out of the way and you'll go off and you'll build some really big things, and they'll be in your corner for the next 20 years, right? Not the next 2. And if you think about it in a long-term methodology, it makes no sense to burn that founder that has mental health issues, right? It just makes no sense.
Yeah, there are some investors that, just a lot of people in general, that still don't quite have the right understanding of the dual-sided nature of mental illness and superpowers, where like these two things go hand in hand. And, as part of this course, I had conversations with Dr. Michael Freeman out of UCSF. He's a psychologist, a psychiatrist. He's also been an entrepreneur and CEO himself. And he studies entrepreneur wellness, well-being, and mental health. That is his area of expertise. And that's the point he makes very clear, in that the research supports it. Is, let's take somebody with bipolar disorder, or somebody that has a heavily sort of trauma influenced background, that is, the trauma is underlying their mental illness, is we tend to have higher propensity to taking risk. So we seek out risk, and more so than the average person. And the way in which we calculate and think about risk, our calculus there is fundamentally different. And so if you're willing to take more risk, there's always the potential for more reward. There's also a shift in reward sensitivity. So when things are going bad, we perceive it as really bad, which again may galvanize us to say, like, okay, it's wartime CEO, even though it's not a war. But you may bring that energy into the business, but the reward sensitivity also swings in the other way, where things go good and you just feel like $1 million, and then that can be the thing that fuels, again, another big push around productivity. And so those are just a couple examples of the attributes of our psychology that are different than the average population. But those attributes simultaneously can not only predispose us towards what would be defined as mental illness, or predispose us towards addiction, but it also predisposes us towards superpowers. You don't get one without the other, is the point. Like, there's growing awareness around this. And that's part of this disclosure conversation, and helping those around you understand the nature of addiction, the nature of mental illness, and what we may be going through. I also want to say one more thing on the disclosure process, and I'd love to get your reaction to this. This is something that I observed and learned over the course of several weeks while I was in an addiction recovery center. And a huge portion of this place, as part of the sort of program and curriculum, was designed around the impact of the addiction and the trauma coming from the addiction on spouses, family, loved ones, and learning how to navigate the person who's addicted or struggling, and how they interact with those that they're closest with, and how they disclose this information properly. And the framing that they provided, I thought, was like a very useful framework, where if you imagine you're in the scenario where you realize you're in active addiction, and you realize the negative consequences associated with that, and how they might have harmed the people around you. When it comes time to disclose, you don't want to necessarily disclose in small batches. It's more about, like, be thoughtful, be prepared. And if you're going to disclose, say, to an investor or to a co-founder, you just lay it all out there one time. And the reason for that is, let's say you go to an investor and you say, okay, hey, I've been drinking a little bit here and there. And the investor's like, okay, well, you should, cut back on that. Let me know if you need some help. And then a week later you say, oh yeah, and I've been doing a little bit of cocaine too. And the investor's like, okay, all right, well, here's somebody for you to talk to. And then a week later you go back and you say, I've been gambling a little bit. You don't want to string together a series of minor disclosures, because that's actually eroding trust every single time that you do that. And when the relationship has already been soured as a result of the active addiction, the thing that you must do, as difficult as it is one solid, thorough disclosure, not to everyone, only to the people that matter most and who are most affected by it. And so I'll pause there, and I'd love to get just your reactions and thoughts to that part of it, because then I'll share the other half of it next. But
yeah, using AA as my North Star, there's this concept of cleaning your side of the street, thoroughly cleaning the side of your street. You can't just sweep up the leaves. You got to clean it all up. And I think that that's right. I think you sit down and you have the conversation and you go from A to Z. I do think there is too much, right? Like you don't need to be specific about all the things that you've been doing, right? Like you can be broad about it. I think that in the context, there's two things here. One is that in the context of entrepreneurship, in your disclosure, you should include a solution, right? What is it that you're going to do in order to solve this issue, right? And if that's I'm going to go away for 45 days, then that's I'm going to go away. If it's I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, then it's doing X, Y, or Z. The other thing is that very often when we talk about entrepreneurs and we talk about drug addiction and we talk about all these various things, we're also being very stereotypically thinking about white male entrepreneurs. And the truth is that for folks that are non-white, non-male, the difficulties are way, way more difficult. The fact that so few women get investment, if they, does that disclosure, does it make it harder? I think the answer is yes. I think it absolutely makes it more difficult if you are a non-white male making that disclosure, and all of a sudden you have a completely different, vector that you have to think about while you're trying to go through this process. Now, the likelihood is that you have investors that have invested in you because, again, of you, not because you're a woman or because you're Black or because of whatever reason, and that they're there to support you and you get the same level of support as sort of the stereotypical white male investor. But I do think that it's important to be thoughtful of that. If you're a parent and you have kids, like if you're a woman investor, a first-time investor, a first-time founder, a woman founder, female founder, anything that is sort of outside of the stereotype, it is much more difficult, and you need to be really thoughtful about it and have hopefully people in your life that you can lean on to sort of test the disclosure before you go in front of your investors and do it. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't call that out.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And just the cultural differences in terms of how the subject of mental illness and addiction is even received or completely rejected within one culture to the next. Like you may not have somebody within your immediate family network, for example, to say, hey, mom, hey, dad, or hey, brother, hey, sister, here's what's going on. Because I chatted with some folks and they're like, no, there's absolutely no way that I can talk about this with any of the members of my family, because they all bring the same bullshit around saying, oh, no, mental illness is made up. It's not real. You have to be very specific around who that first disclosure goes to, right? And that's, again, on the 12-step side. That's why it's so beneficial, even though these are people that you don't know. It's a great environment for that first disclosure and to test those first disclosures, because the unifying thing is everyone's there to try and heal themselves and get clean, and no judgment. Just respect, love, and support. Like that's a good environment to practice and to develop this ability to disclose and to develop the ability to identify who's the right type of person for me to be able to speak to about this. Because some people weaponize that information against you, and it's sad but true. And that's the last thing that you need when you're trying to get healthy. There's another angle on it, which is when I was building off of all the experiences I had going through the addiction recovery was, so in the context of a pre-existing relationship, that's where this thoughtful, one-time, full disclosure makes a ton of sense, because there are people or a person around you that you have already harmed as a result of the illness and addiction. Therefore, one large disclosure is important because it's going to hurt, but you don't want to hurt them multiple times such that they just can't even trust what you're saying. But then there's the other side of it, which is, let's say in this scenario, you're an entrepreneur, you went and left the prior company, went and got clean and sober, and you've done a bunch of work on yourself. You understand the nature of your mental health differences. And now you're moving in a new direction, and it's time to start something new. And so now you're confronted with the scenario of, I'm establishing new relationships, and what must I disclose to these new relationships? And how do I disclose it if I must? And how is that different than when I do this other disclosure to the people that I'm already connected with, my investors, my execs, you name it. So I guess the question is, in this scenario of you're on to the next company, on to the new investors, where now it's disclosure to them for the first time at the beginning of the process. Does it make sense to disclose? Must they disclose? And if they do, how does that unfold? What does it look like in that scenario?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the major difference is that the employees and investors that you have when you try to get sober, when you first attempt your sobriety, and hopefully it sticks, you've hurt them and you owe them at least some level of explanation. I think at some level. And yes, there are legal things and there are cultural things and there's a million other things. But in the context of sobriety, I think that you've hurt the people around you. You cannot not hurt people when you're not sober. In the second instance, I am sober, right? So like I am probably living close to my best life at that point and living a life of, love and tolerance and doing well. And all of a sudden it becomes less important that I disclose every little thing. The bigger issue that I think, though, is that if it were to come out, right, because investors speak to each other and entrepreneurs speak to each other, and I didn't say anything, then I feel like that's worse, right? And so hopefully you're saying I've been sober for a number of years, right, and life is different and it's fine. And I'm also surprised. One of the things that I was really surprised at was how often I would talk to an investor or other entrepreneur and been like, yeah, I've been sober now for like 4 years, or I don't drink. And they'd be like, yeah, me too. Yes. Right. And there was like the wink, wink, got it. And then you just kind of kept going. I think that's the other side of it, is that because so much of addiction is ego based, right? Getting rid of that ego as part of the process. That ego tells you that you are the only person in your immediate vicinity that is the alcoholic or the drug addict, and therefore everybody else is normal and everybody else is perfect, right? Like that is the curse of being an entrepreneur, is the assumption that everybody else's life is great while your life sucks. The truth is that everybody's life sucks, right? And that there are tons of people that have gone through sobriety. There are millions and millions and millions of people that have gone through AA, and millions of people that have gotten sober without AA. The likelihood that you talk to somebody that has dealt with drugs and alcohol in their life is gigantic. And so having that conversation should not be scary.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's been my experience, is it'll shock you when you have some of these disclosure conversations, again, selectively maintaining your boundaries, your respect, not sharing with anyone where there's a potential that they weaponize that against you. But when you share it, there's a surprising number of people that are like, oh yeah, me too. Or yeah, my brother, my dad, my sister. It's shocking. And then it's almost this instant sort of bond. Like, you get it. We can trust each other, right? Well, and to build on this scenario of, new investors, new company, new team, new execs, when an entrepreneur is healthy, in recovery, and in a good place, the framing that I like to offer too is that whereas in the first scenario, you don't want progressive disclosure of a little bit at a time, in the second scenario, you absolutely want progressive disclosure. Because let's imagine you've been sober a couple of years, brand new investor you're connecting with, and then it's like, hey, let me tell you a little bit about my past. And then you spend 30 minutes dumping a payload on them that they're unprepared for. One, you may traumatize them because they might have never heard that shit before. Right?
Yeah.
Two, so much of what you learn when working on your own mental health differences and working through addiction is this boundary setting, and being able to establish healthy boundaries between you and others, both external and internal boundaries. And the process of progressively disclosing to new relationships is a healthy practice in setting boundaries that you are in control of, that you allow to slowly open up over time. To give an equivalent of, like, if I were to be dating somebody and we're really getting along, On the third date, I'm not going to sit there and say, okay, let me tell you about how my mom died and all the awful stuff around it, right? Like that may be too heavy, too quick, too early.
No.
But over the course of weeks and months, as you do get closer, you can reveal more parts of it as it makes sense to along the way. And again, you don't have to go into all the ugly details of it. That is unnecessary. But it's a healthy thing that with new relationships, you do slowly disclose. And so I wanted to share that as a suggestion and a basic way of sort of positioning these two scenarios against each other of either the full disclosure and the progressive disclosure and when to use each.
I do think the other thing that you have to be aware of is that when you are gaining investment, the likelihood of there being a background check is really, really high. And the likelihood of something coming up where you have to explain the DUI you got 20 years ago. I used to coach lacrosse, kids in lacrosse, and I was at a high school and they did a background check and it came up that I had gotten a DUI, I don't know, 10 or 15 years before that date. And I had to explain to the principal that, yeah, I used to be a drug addict and alcoholic and I am no longer, or at least I'm in recovery. And yeah, so you usually cannot hide these things as much as you think you can.
Yeah, it's going to come up. And in these scenarios where integrity matters quite a bit, if they get the sense that like, I question this person's integrity, not because of what they might have done in addiction, but because they're unwilling to reveal these things to me that are actually essential to their ability to function and run as leader of a company. It's understandable. Like you said, investors aren't bad people. If anything, what I've experienced is many of them are wired similar to entrepreneurs around risk taking, the reward sensitivity, the really high highs and the really low lows. When you think of it, like the dependent variable involved here is propensity for risk. When somebody's gone through a lot of trauma or they have addictions, or they have these mental health differences such as bipolar disorder, the calculation around risk is very different. And so it explains why some of the comedians who are willing to take the risk could get on stage and saying the shit that they say that no one else is willing to say. A lot of comedians have suffered. A lot of comedians have dealt with addiction. That's not a coincidence. And the same is true around entrepreneurs. And the same is also true around investors. Like it, arguably, venture capitalists, especially early stage ones, are playing like one of the highest risk forms of poker on the planet. So these are risk-seeking people. And it's not unheard of for risk-seeking people to have a higher probability of being attached to mental health differences and addiction.
The other great thing about disclosing is that I remember when I first started taking medication for my bipolar, and it was like 5 or 6 months in, and I was talking to somebody that worked for me, and he said, Miha, you're different. I said, how am I different? And they said, I now know how you're going to react to me when I say something. Right? Because when you're bipolar, you're all over the place, and you like, somebody may tell you the best news in the world, you may get pissed off, right? They can tell you the worst news and you get super happy about it. Like it's just, you're all over the place emotionally. And I was just consistent. And so the idea that you're going from being inconsistent to consistent is actually a huge benefit when you're talking about running a company, and that the people beneath you understand that, and beneath you sounds so bad, but the people you work with, they understand that consistency, right? Consistency and reliability is the basis of any relationship. And all of a sudden you're adding those two things. If I'm an investor and somebody says, hey, I have bipolar, but I'm medicated for it, I'm handling it, I'm taking care of it, I know that those two things are really important to them, consistency and reliability. The likelihood of them being successful goes up.
That's a great point. It's a really good point. And just as an aside, one of the things I'll put in the show notes for the folks that are going to listen to this, I'll put links to resources for whether it's, finding online 12-step meetings or local in-person meetings. I'll pull together a list of resources and make sure that those are available alongside this. So Miha, there's one more area that I would like to dive into, which is the question of the type of company to run and build for somebody who may have this predisposition towards mental health differences and addiction. the big high level question is, should they be running? Like, let's say somebody's like, okay, I have bipolar disorder. I know it comes with these superpowers, but I also know it comes with these great risks to my own well-being. Should I run a venture-backed startup? There are multiple flavors of types of companies that can be run, but I'd love to just get your thoughts on that. How does that factor into your day-to-day decisions now around the types of businesses to build and the way in which you work in general?
Yeah, I would say for me, first of all, nobody should do a startup unless you got a real death wish. Like, they are very, very hard. They are the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. And I've done a mediocre job, right? Like, I am not, I haven't sold a company for $500 million. I am not in FU money status, right? Like, I am at best a mediocre founder. They are hard. And even for the best, the people that I know that have made 10s and 20s and 30s and hundreds of millions of dollars, it was really, really hard. And you're adding a level of difficulty if you include addiction or mental health into it. So more power to you if you want to do a startup. Like, as a fully stereotypically functioning person, like, great. You want to add difficulty to it, it makes it even harder. On the other hand, something like 40% of all entrepreneurs, or some large percentage, deal with mental health in some way, shape, or form, right? So clearly it is a catalyst for entrepreneurship. When I was manic and I could get work done, I could work the work of 10 people, right? Like, I could get so much done. In fact, once I got medicated, I actually went to go see a therapist specifically about relearning how to work now that I didn't have the mania to lean into. Right. Because I didn't know how to do it, because I would wait and wait and wait. It would hit. I would do all my work and I would do what I need to do. And then away I would go. And all of a sudden that was gone. And I'm like, holy shit, I don't know how to do this. Right. I don't know how to work like a quote unquote normal person. And so I had to teach myself how to do it. Like, what does a to-do list actually look like? How do you use it? How do you set up meetings? How do you manage your day? I think that people that are dealing with addiction specifically, because I don't want to tie addiction to mental health as if those two things are always tied together. They are different. That people dealing with addiction tend to be really good at problem solving, like really good at problem solving. So taking on a role or a business where problem solving becomes important, I think is something that somebody who has dealt with addiction and has survived addiction can do a really good job at. I've seen like construction, home building, like things where like math matters and like problem solving matters and negotiation matters, right? People who have dealt with addiction are usually very, very good at those things. Product managers, right? Great role. And product managers make great entrepreneurs. And so I think running down that kind of business, I think, is really good. On the mental health side, it has to be somebody somebody who has passion around the things that you're doing, because you do have to overcome the mental health. Mental health doesn't disappear. It doesn't get solved, right? It's going to be there for the rest of your life. You may find a diet, you may find medicine, you may find a way of living that reduces the impact, but it doesn't disappear, right? I still get manic, not as much or as often, and I still get depressed, not as much as often, but I do. And so I need to be able to be in a type of work that enables me to be able to manage that. I realized to add complexity to all of it, I got Lyme disease. And so if you add Lyme disease to addiction and to mental health, I got a nice little triangle there. I decided that I couldn't start a company anymore. Like, probably me being an entrepreneur was not in the cards. Could I do it? Probably, but there are so many things that were required. I need to have enough money to hire enough people, to run the company in a way that enables me to do the things that I can do as CEO. I also think that starting a company doesn't require you to be the CEO. You can be any role you want to be within a company. As a founder, you can be a designer, you could be the janitor. It doesn't matter. You're still the founder. So for me, what I realized was that I couldn't start another company. I just don't have it in me. I don't have the energy to do it any longer. And that was really sad. It was really sad to come to that realization, right? To be like, if I'm going to run a company, it's got to be like the right situation. And that right situation is so minimal that it's probably never going to happen again. And so I had to realize that I was never going to be a billionaire, right? I was never going to be $100 million in the bank kind of guy. And so I had to come up with an understanding of what enough was for me and what life was enough. And I think that's the answer to what kind of business that you want to run, is what kind of company, business role can you take that enables you to live the life that you want to live. And understanding enough isn't like enough money, right? Money matters. Like I want to buy the things I want to buy. But what enough for me is that every day at 3:00, I can go take my dog and walk around the block, right? For me, enough is the fact that I can get up in the morning and I have a general idea on what I'm going to do in the day, but most likely I'm going to talk to somebody who's super interesting, right? Enough for me is that my family loves me, right? And they're willing to like fly to Seattle to hang out, right? Which they never would have done back in the day. Enough for me is just that, is just living a life where I know that I'm helping other people and I'm adding value to the world. And as long as I'm doing that, I'm good. And so I've built a career and a lifestyle that enables me to hit that enough. And I think that's the question that somebody who's dealing with addiction or dealing with mental health needs to ask themselves, is what is enough for me? And what do I need to do to achieve that? And if that's starting a company, start a company. If it's not, then don't. Either way, you'll live a great life.
Yeah, there's three core questions that I pose to people if I'm, for example, coaching them through a midlife transition away from, say, being an executive into whatever's next for them in their lives. The first one is, I say, like, you have to be able to write somewhere around 3 to 5 statements, no longer than a tweet, that describe the way of living that you want for yourself. So how do you want to be living? Not goals, not objectives. What lifestyle do you want? That's one. Question 2 is, what are you unwilling to give up? And question 3 is, what are you willing to give up? Those 3 things. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, if they just pause for a moment before jumping into the deep end and hopping onto the never-ending treadmill of raising venture capital dollars and all that stuff, just said, hey, let me ask myself those 3 questions. And then, ask this fourth that you pose, which is like, what's enough? I was like, 100 million doesn't have to be it, right? Just because I read about, somebody my age who made that much money on TechCrunch. That's sort of the centrifugal force that pulls everyone into this same model of being an entrepreneur. And there's so many different ways to do it. Like you, is like, after 16, 17 years of startup operations and a couple of years as an investor, I reached this point after a couple near face plants where my body and my mind was just begging me to stop. I finally reached this point where I came to an understanding of the nature of how I'm designed and how I run. And I said, like, yeah, I will never be in an executive position again. Yeah. My skill, like my capabilities from a skill standpoint, isn't the limiting factor. But I've come to understand and accept that my nervous system is wired in a way to where my default is my nervous system is on. And if my baseline is highly anxious, highly nervous, irritable, agitated, why would I subject myself to 12 or 13 hours a day of additional stress 5-6 days a week for the next 10, 20 years? And so I made the choice. I said, fuck it. Like, enough is enough. And similarly had this grieving process as well of like, I could have been the CEO of a $1 billion company, or it could have been this, and could have been that. And I did the math on it. I was like, yeah, if I worked for another 7 to 10 years, I would have made 5 to 10 times as much money. Reasonable confidence on that too. And now, a couple years removed from all that, I realized, like, so what would I have even done with that? I probably would have just become a huge degenerate. And I don't know, there's just so many different flavors of doing things. You could go into it and say, you know what, I'm going to raise a round, I'm going to raise a second, and then I'm going to disclose to the investors and everyone else up front, like, after that first or second round, our goal is cash flow positive, break even. Yep. And we're going to perpetuate the business on its own cash flow and no more fundraising. I'm going to hop off of that shit. I'm going to take the role of CTO or chief strategy officer, or chief product officer, the role that allows me to play offense on product and on distribution. but that pulls me out of the defense of dealing with, HR issues, lawsuits, this bullshit, that bullshit, all the stuff that proliferates as the company gets bigger. Make that choice. That's okay. Pull yourself out of that shit if you know who you are. For me, that's kind of like the big message is, before you jump into this, spend time developing that self-knowledge and that awareness, and then move forward, and you could establish something that's fantastic. But it needs to be done so with that awareness of what can you and should you put yourself through.
And what do you not want? Like, I had a therapist tell me that the best thing about dating is you learn what you don't want in a relationship.
It's very true.
Right. And it's kind of the same thing when you're out there, taking a job at Facebook, right? Is you're learning what you don't like. And over time, sometimes you realize that, like, it doesn't take a lot to live a great life.
Yeah.
If I've learned anything in my 50 plus years, is that it doesn't take a lot to live a good life. And I don't mean a lot of money. I just mean a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of nothing, right? Like, it is pretty easy to live a good life if you are willing to understand what enough is. What is your line, right? And stick to that line. There are friends of mine that I know that make tons of money, that make no money, that make it all in the middle. And I can't tell you that one of them is living a better life than the other.
Yeah, there is a general trend. And I was on this trend of, like, if you're just jumping from one treadmill to the next, expecting that you're going to get to the end of that treadmill, and then that's where fulfillment and happiness lives, then you're chasing an illusion, and that's a guaranteed way of making sure that you remain unhappy. Well, hey, that great chat. Love the conversation. Yeah. I mean, thanks. This is a sort of like real talk and practical rubber meets road stuff that I just think more entrepreneurs should hear. And you bring a wonderful perspective to the table. And I really appreciate your openness and all the work that you're doing to help the next generation of leaders. So thank you for spending the time sharing this wisdom with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.